Today's seminar is on how to write proposals and secure grants. And Al Cooper is our speaker today. And I'm just going to give you a little background on his career. So he got his PhD in physics at the University of Columbia on accelerator studies of elementary particles. And then he became a faculty member at the same university just before coming here as an ASP postdoc in 1973. In 1974, for a decade, he went to the University of Wyoming, where where he was assistant associate professor for about 10 years in atmospheric science. Then he came back to NCAR in 1984 as a scientist 3 and scientist 4, and he stayed here until 2012. So in that time, he's done a lot of things. He's been at MMM, M3, and ATD, which is now EOL. In 1994, he became director of the Advanced Study Program, the ASP program at NCAR, until 2003. Then in 2003 and 2004, he was program director of physical meteorology at the National Science Foundation. In 2004, for about 9 months, he was acting director of EOL. And then from 2004 to 2012, he was chief scientist of HIAPER at EOL, and he retired in 2012. So now he's a senior scientist emeritus. And yeah, I think I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I've given this talk a few times, once before to the ECSA, I think about 4 years ago. So I apologize if some of you were here then and have heard it and are going to see some familiar material, because although it's a little bit different, it's not much different. As I said in the abstract, I've tried to design it to be interesting to early career investigators who might want to seek grants. And I've divided this into 3 parts: developing an idea for the project, designing the project once you have the idea, and some problems that people often encounter when writing the proposal. Now, I'm going to mix this in, because I can't resist, with some advice, career advice, regarding how you might use grants to further your career. And I'll explain why I want to talk about that as I go, but I think it's rather important to include that rather than just the dry discussion of what you do to write a proposal. And I'll apologize if a lot of this seems obvious. It should. On the other hand, it's amazing to me as a former program officer how often people don't do these kind of things. So I think it's worth saying and writing down, and I'm going to leave this presentation as a reference that can be posted someplace on the ECSA website, partly because there are a lot of links in it to other material that I think might be useful. Let's start by thinking about this a little bit strategically. By that I mean, let's start with the goal. Your goal is not to get funded, it's to further your career. And you don't want to mix those up. You don't want to think that getting funding is the objective, because there are some traps here that I'm going to talk about as we go. So you have to think as you go, how is this going to advance your career? What will it do for you? And in each step, try to think of what you should do in that regard. So if you're going to think strategically, let's start with how does it fit into your 5 or 10-year career plan? You do have such a plan, right? You should. You should be thinking that way. Where do you want to be in 5 years? How does this help you get there? When I say cost benefit, there are real costs to this. You have to consider that it's going to take your time. It's going to divert you from other things. If you want to do this, you have to be sure that what you get from it is worth that effort. And of course, you have to factor in institutional expectations, whether you're at NCAR or someplace else, there is a sense, and a growing sense, that expects people to help contribute to the overall funding of the work here. Now, in addition to thinking about this, be sure to talk to your mentors about it. And this is a chance for me to say my favorite thing about mentors, which is that the mentor and person being menteed have very different roles in this. And it's the person who receives the advice who has the obligation to start this. The mentor has the obligation to be open to it, to be willing to, but people often are reluctant to come to you and say, you ought to do this, or I think this is, that's not necessarily the role that is comfortable, much more comfortable to have you go to them. So this is primarily your responsibility to seek that advice. And of course, not just people who are farther along in their careers than you, but also with your peers. And planning in this way can help you involve this entanglement, which here I refer to as the external funding trap. By that I mean that I see people often start into a search for funding, find something to do which isn't quite maybe what they really wanted to do, but they think they can do it. They think they can get funding for this. They do that. They find that the work that they need to do needs people, and they have some money that might come with the grant, and they use the money to hire people, and suddenly they have a group where they have to support the group, and they have to write the next proposal, and pretty soon what they're doing is trying to maintain activity rather than pursuing the plan, which started back here in their career plan. So you don't want to get trapped being pulled away from what you want to do by success. Some of the best advice that I received in my career, I think, is from a person who told me, have many ideas, some of them good. What he meant by that was think a lot. You need to have lots of thoughts. You have to be stewing over this while you're riding your bike or while you're sitting trying to do yoga or whatever is your activity. These ought to be stewing away because you want to be thinking about things all the time. You want to read, talk to colleagues, attend conferences. All of these are prompts to originality. Originality, I think, really arises from the interaction of different ideas and different people. That you're working on something and you're diverted to think about something else, and suddenly you see a connection that wasn't there before. Those are important, and they only arise if you're active and if you're thinking a lot. Another thing you can do in preparation is to read proposals. You can ask people for examples. You can assemble collections. There used to be one in ASP. I don't know if there still is. It's a good thing that ECSA might think about doing, is to collect examples of proposals that you can go and read, because it's very valuable to see what kind of things people have put together, and especially the ones that have succeeded, but also some of the ones that have failed, if people are willing to give you those, are informative as to what was weak about them. You can also volunteer to be a reviewer of proposals. Program officers really like this. They're always looking for reviewers, and if you are not on their list right now, and you send them an email and say, I'm a relatively new investigator in this area, but I have some expertise in whatever the topic is, you'll probably get a proposal to review quite quickly, because they welcome new people, and the search for reviewers is a difficult part of their job. Again, back to the general advice topic. My sense is that the best routes to success, either in an academic career or at NCAR, are through thematic research. By that I mean develop something to the point where you become the world's expert. You become known for a particular thing. You use that as the basis for your community reputation. That's much more effective in getting you into a role as an acknowledged leader than is a whole slew of different disorganized contributions to projects and papers. If you end up with a bunch of papers and they're all in various areas, well, people will say, wow, that scientist is really broad, but when it comes to leadership, that's a weakness. So it's very useful to think about a thematic approach to your research. And in doing that, unsolicited proposals are extremely valuable because they can let you do what you want to. Now, as NCAR scientists, you're not allowed to submit unsolicited proposals to a lot of the groups at the Science Foundation, although there are some that you can. But we have the advantage that some of the base funding can supplement what we're going to do, and we can use that to develop this. So in this mix between unsolicited and solicited proposals, the unsolicited ones can be replaced by our core funding, and you can use that to try to establish these themes. If you do that, then you can approach targeted solutions considering how do they work to add to what you want to do. Does this particular one fit into your research theme? Can you take advantage of this to match your interests? So these are very different approaches to funding. And in terms of planning, you can't start too early. You need to be doing this all the time because things come up, deadlines approach. This takes more time than anyone ever expects, and people always have trouble meeting deadlines. So don't wait until the announcement comes out to start thinking about what you want to do. It would be much better for you to have generally thought about what you're going to do and wait for the right announcement. Now, how do you learn about opportunities? Once you have a general idea of what you're going to do, then I have some sources for you on this that might be very useful. The first one is extremely useful. If you don't know about it, you ought to immediately check out grants.gov. It is the central point of contact for all 26 federal agencies who award grants. It has almost everything that the government offers. It's searchable. You can arrange for email notice of opportunities in particular areas. It has a lot of tutorial information, regarding how do you design projects and write proposals. A lot of it is provided by the NSF, and it's an extremely complete source. You can also submit proposals through grants.gov. It has some information on non-federal sources also, not very much, a little bit on foundations, but it's mostly the government. Now, in addition, there are some other points to look at. This link to NCAR budget and planning is an exceptionally important one right now because the NCAR process has changed in the last year in significant ways. And everybody ought to look at that now. That is important to know what NCAR is expecting of us as we write proposals. And I'm not going to talk about that. That's something that I'm going to just point you to that website and tell you, follow the rules. They're very important and they're different from what they were. There's some links to opportunities on the UCAR contract site. There's nsf.gov, and it's useful because you can subscribe to new announcements either by email or an RSS feed. So this is, if you go to nsf.gov/mynsf, you can set up your own page that provides you a lot of that. The Federal Register is the grand encompassing site. Everything is there, but it's probably more information than you can sort through. The AGU maintains a very nice site for funding opportunities for members only, but if you are a member or can get someone to let you in, that's a very good place to start. And I'm going to just list some of the others. I'm putting them here mostly because if this gets posted, these are live links and you can use them. So here's NASA, NOAA, EPA, foundations. Universities used to be really good at providing their own sites of guidance. They've almost all now gone to this Grant Forward website. It is unfortunately something that you have to subscribe to, but they will give you a free 2-week trial, and it's well worth looking at. It's a good way of finding things. So don't miss the announcements. There's a huge volume of things to look into. You need to check regularly because they're appearing all the time, and if you sign up, you'll get some notice of these. Now watch especially for new investigator awards, assuming that you are a new investigator. The reason is that many programs have targets for new investigator awards. The program officers are required to make some fraction of their awards to new investigators. So they're looking for you. They're looking for opportunities to do this and help you early in your career, usually because they really want to also, but also because it's part of their job review. How did you do at this? So when you're look for ones that favor new investigators, or identify yourself as a new investigator when you're talking to the program officers and discussing this. They should know that. Okay, I'm not going to talk more about how you get the idea. That's obviously dependent on your area. You have to work through that. You have to come up with some idea. But I want to talk a little bit about characteristics that it ought to have. Let's think about some test questions. Is it original and different or only incremental? This is a distinction that is remarkably important at the review stage. Reviewers, maybe the most common criticism I saw as a program officer was, this is only incremental. This is adding a little bit to what we know, but it's not very exciting, and people won't react to it very, very favorably. Much better to do something different and original. Ask if it's interesting to others. This is hard because lots of things are interesting to you that are on the perimeter, and maybe your colleagues can tell you might have a hard time selling that. Don't be too discouraged, but consider if it's interesting to others. It is very important to consider if it will result in something that's publishable. Now, you don't want to undertake it if it's not. That's kind of a measure of quality, but it's also why you're doing this. To further your career is the objective here, and if what comes out is not going to be publishable, well, that's a test that ought to warn you against going any further. And of course, you have to see a clear route to getting someplace with it, to some kind of a goal that you can define. One more time, does it fit your career plan? Make sure that you think about that. Once you've satisfied yourself that this is a good idea, it's still worth talking to everybody about it. Make sure you talk to your colleagues. Some people are hesitant to do this. They think, oh, I have a good idea. I don't want to tell anybody. Maybe somebody will steal my idea. This is almost never a real concern. Much more productive is to talk to people about it, to get their advice and reactions, to especially get information from your mentors on whether or not it's worthwhile, and supervisor regarding, you'll need that to know if you really ought to proceed. I like to suggest people talk to the program officers. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute, what you should do in that kind of a conversation. But I think it's preferable to have that conversation rather than to push ahead. Okay, all of this is delaying tactic to tell you, don't start writing. design, plan, try to get your concepts organized, your thoughts organized, and at some point you'll want to do a literature review. That's going to have to be put into the proposal in any case. You have to show, not just because it's a requirement, but because the reviewers are looking for this. You have to show that you know the background in this area and that you can provide a concise summary of what is important in what has already been done. And if you don't do that, if you omit that or do it poorly, people will wonder if you're really qualified to do this. So do the literature review. One thing that I have seen change in my time as a scientist is the use of hypotheses. 20 years ago, very few proposals were written in terms of hypotheses. You might think that's strange. The scientific method, after all, is broadly designed as you propose a hypothesis, you test it, and you move forward with what you can continue to accept or reject. But most proposals 20 years ago weren't phrased in that form. They were phrased more in the sense of we're going to do this and try to study this, try to understand this. Those are dangerous words. Advanced understanding, you want to test things. You want to make progress, not just study things. So developing some specific hypotheses, some small number focused on a high impact idea, is by far the best next step. And one of those NCAR rules that I'm not going over in detail here calls for collaboration, or there are some other options, but there are a number of requirements that have to be met in terms of collaborating with outside university investigators or developing facilities for community use. So you have to start planning for that and get your potential collaborators lined up if you need them. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this. This is obvious, but keep planning. Here is a suggestion that you put together an informal pre-proposal. That's a good time to do that, even if it's not required for your submission, for your own guidance, for talking to other people, and I'll show you in a minute how I suggest that you use it with the program officer. Okay, programs vary in what the review criteria are. NSF has these two broad areas. One is intellectual merit. That's mostly what you think about as science, as science potential. Does it advance knowledge? Does the person have good qualifications? Is it original? Does the research proposal look good? Are the resources available? Those all fall into intellectual merit. But there's also an area which is increasingly emphasized at the Science Foundation and other places, which goes under the name of broader impacts. It includes such things as development of human resources in a particular research area, addressing diversity, enhancing various aspects of infrastructure available for research, benefit to society. Often there are good arguments you can make in atmospheric science regarding benefit to society, or even benefits beyond the immediate research field. It will develop something that is applied elsewhere. So these have to be discussed in the proposal, and this is a good time to start thinking about how they will be addressed. Okay, I already said this. Let me just once more. This is the NCAR site. If you're submitting this through NCAR, you want to go to this website. Let me talk about some of the significant components in the proposal. I want to spend a little time on goals, which you ought to state in terms of a goal and objectives. I'm going to talk about those as being slightly different. The dictionary says they're synonymous, but I use them in the sense of, well, I'll explain the sense in a second. You then want to develop your hypotheses and approaches to the problem. Critical tests. It's not enough to just state the hypothesis. How are you going to test them? What would refute them? What will develop confidence that you can make some progress in this research? And finally, you need to give some thought to what the scope of the project is. How long will it take? Who else will need to be involved? Is it going to be practical with the resources available and the time you have? It's best to limit the scope to something that you can do. So at this point, you're starting to put together an outline. My best advice on this is to focus on the core of the project. I see proposals time after time start out with a good idea, and they start to develop that idea, and then they start rambling. They add somebody to work on something that's related. They move into the possibility that this will affect something else. They jump from point to point, and pretty soon there are 10 things that they're going to do, only loosely under one umbrella for the proposal. It gets scattered, it loses focus, and it will review poorly. Much better to try to make your proposal focus on what is the core. And you can occasionally reference something else that might be a direction for this to go. But don't spend a lot of time on that because it detracts from constructing a good story. Okay, here's my program officer slide. A lot of people wonder if they ought to contact the program officer. And the answer is it depends on program and officer, but it usually can't hurt, and it sometimes can help a great deal. So I recommend trying this. Where it doesn't work is if there's a solicited announcement, an announcement for solicited proposals, and the program officer thinks that somehow it's a conflict of interest if he or she talks to you about what you're proposing to do. That will happen rarely, but most of the time program officers are very willing to talk to you. However, don't just call them up out of the blue and say, I'd like to talk to you about this idea. Instead, the best is to send that pre-proposal I was talking about before, a short statement of what you want to do with some kind of an approximate budget, and request an opportunity to discuss it with them. Then they know what they're getting into. Then they can think about it ahead of time. When you call, they will be much more open to talking to you. The reason I encourage people to do this is that there are many program officers that expect it, that are even slightly offended when people don't contact them ahead of time because they think they're not giving them a chance to help and getting them involved in the process. There were people I worked with at the Science Foundation who felt so strongly that they would come storming out of the office saying, I just got a proposal and it's bad and I could have made it better, and why didn't this person contact me? And it really was upsetting to them. They can help you avoid problems, sometimes provide advice that will avoid a resubmission. However, when you talk to them, ask reasonable questions and listen. Don't ask questions like this one, which is the end of almost every call that I got. Do you think you can fund this proposal? Depends on how good it is. Depends on how it reviews. It's a worthless question. Don't ask that. Do listen. Don't try to convince the program officer. This person is going to evaluate your proposal fairly, but at this point, he or she doesn't know it well enough to do that evaluation. And so it does no good to try to argue with them. Instead, you want to explain enough about it so that they can tell you things. And listen, don't just talk 90% of the time and then say, oh, do you have anything to say now? Listen to what they have to say. Okay, that's all in terms of planning the project. Now, let's turn to writing and some comments that I can make on the writing. You'll sometimes hear people tell you that if you've done all this planning and you have outlines and you've written your goals and all of that, that the writing will be easy. Don't believe it. Writing is hard work no matter what. Writing is going to require time, and unfortunately, you're writing this for 5 people or so who are going to be the reviewers and the program officer. So not very many people are going to read that. It's a big temptation to skimp, to say, maybe I don't have to edit this one more time because it's just going to be read by 5 people. But those people are going to determine whether or not you get funded, and they react to good construction and organization in the proposal. It means it reflects on your ability. It reflects on your organization in your thinking, and a poorly organized proposal can really shoot down a project. So don't neglect this. Work on the writing. Okay, I'm going to just mention what a typical NSF proposal is, right? It's like partly just to indicate that there are rules and you have to follow them strictly. 15 pages, 1 page, don't include extraneous material in the bibliography, follow the format for bio sketches. All of those might seem arbitrary to you, but especially the Science Foundation doesn't treat them that way. If you're one word over 15 pages, they'll send it back to you. And I often have had people call me and say, I sent you a proposal and it came back almost in return mail. Why didn't you at least consider it? And I have to tell them, I never saw it. You never got through the processing office because you didn't meet the requirements for the solicitation. So they will do that, and you want to avoid that, especially if there's a deadline, because it's a disastrous way to miss a deadline, to miss a requirement like that and have them send it back to you the last day that the thing is open. I'm not going to talk about this. I put it in here in case it's useful to someone in trying to develop an outline for a project. What I am going to talk about now is goals and objectives. This is how I use goals and objectives. I regard the goal as the broad thematic area that you're addressing. This is something that might be too broad for you to provide the all-encompassing solution, but it's the general statement of the problem, and you expect to contribute to progress in this area. For example, a goal that I personally once used and dug out of one of my old proposals is determine if measurements of ice nucleus concentrations provide useful predictions of the ice concentrations that develop in cloud. Well, that's a fairly ambitious goal. It says, do these have any meaning? Are they really determining how the ice concentrations develop? And I'm not going to solve that in one proposal, but I can get some good information on it. To do that, I can develop some objectives that are much more specific. These are what you do expect to accomplish. They will be more limited in scope, and they're achievable in the period of the proposed grant. So you can then follow up and say, and this is what I'm going to do to make progress in this area. And these are the specific results that I expect. So, okay, I'm not going to solve this for all time, but I'm going to provide some evidence that shows that in these cases, there seems to be a correlation between these, and maybe that there's a connection. Let me give you some examples of poor goals. These are ones I actually received, and I quote them anonymously and hope that the people never realize I'm using them as varying degrees of bad. This is very bad. Provide a quantum leap in understanding the roles of clouds in climate. That doesn't tell me anything except the general area, which I already knew from the proposal title. That's not a goal. This is getting a little bit better. Develop an integrated modeling tool for incorporating microphysical processes in mesoscale models. That tells me at least what they're trying to do, but this isn't really the goal. The goal is to represent microphysical processes better in mesoscale models. And to do that, they're going to develop a tool to do that. So this is kind of getting caught up in the process and saying that that's the goal. It's not as bad as the first one, but it's still not very good. Here are some more bad ones. Develop innovative advances. Well, everything we're trying to do is to develop innovative advances. Again, a meaningless comment, excuse me. And here's one that's pretty close to nonsense too. Bridge the accuracy gap. What measurements are we talking about? What's going to happen? It's really just saying that we're going to develop more accurate ways of measuring some trace gases. And that's a nice goal, but it ought to be more specific. So these are my examples of what I think are poor goals. Let me show you a couple that I liked. Research goal is to determine which processes in cloud are responsible for charge separation in cases of inverted polarity lightning, and to demonstrate their significance in a numerical cloud model. This was then followed by a number of objectives of what the person was actually going to do. It was a very good proposal. It reviewed very well. And I like that statement because I know just what they're trying to do. Determine concentrations of giant sea salt particles ingested into trade wind cumuli and test if they are responsible for rapid precip formation in such clouds. See that word test? So much more powerful here than study. Again, followed by specific objectives and tests in a good proposal that ended up being very highly rated. Okay, let me turn to more detailed writing advice. The first thing to look at is the NSF grant and proposal guide. Especially if you're going to NSF, you have to do this, but it has great information for any project. This is a live link. It will get you to that. You ought to become quite familiar with that. There are some useful comments in there that I wanted to highlight. The first one is, we provide funds on the basis of merit, not need. People constantly would say, I need this to advance my career. If you don't fund this, I'm going to have to retire. I don't know what I'm going to do. Appealing to the humanitarian instincts of the program officer, that's not the way the game's played. If that's true, then you have to write a good proposal which has enough merit that it can be funded, because the Science Foundation isn't interested in what you need. It's interested in what you can do that has merit. Again, they advise doing projects that, in their words, are innovative, not catch-up. That's my incremental step phrase from before. In the proposal, it's useful to present preliminary work. People often ask me this with this worry again that somebody's going to see this, somebody's going to steal their work. They don't want to give their good idea away. People worry much too much about that. I don't know of any cases where that has happened. If it were to happen, there are extremely strict ethical follow-up groups at all the funding agencies, and especially the Science Foundation, that would make it very unwise for a reviewer to ever do something like that. You shouldn't worry about that. It's much more useful to show that you can do something and to show the direction that this is going and not worry about people might steal this idea. Okay, and again, there are lots and lots of specific requirements in here, and you just have to follow the rules. There's a wonderful book called Eloquent Science. It's been around now, I guess, 4 years or so, maybe 5 years. David Schultz. It's a great source for improving all aspects of your writing. I recommend it. I recommend ECSA get a copy if you don't have one and stick it where people can see it. I have one and consult it frequently. It's a wonderful book, a good source of advice on writing. And it's focused on our kind of writing. That's what makes it valuable. It's focused on scientific writing. Okay, for whom do you want to write? Primarily the reviewers. The program officer will see this, but it's the reviewers that you have to impress. And remember that their expertise might not overlap exactly with yours, especially in cases where proposals are evaluated in sets where they span a large range and they assemble panels. Some of the people on those panels won't have a very good idea of what your direct research area is. So make sure you write to someone who is in related science, but not necessarily exactly the science area that you are pursuing. Avoid jargon. Try to make it understandable to someone who's a little bit outside your area. Then secondarily, you write for the program officer. And the main thing you can do there is to make it easy to find key information. He or she is going to want to look for information regarding the review criteria, concise summaries, an explanation of the approach to be taken. And if you identify those and say, here it is, this is why this addresses the evaluation criteria, it means they're going to do a better job of finding that material and evaluating it. It will advance your cause a lot. I'm going to skip that. The most important thing on this slide is this comment about avoid mistakes. A mistake is much more harmful than it should be. If you misquote some of the work in your literature review, if you develop part of the argument that you're trying to advance in terms of in terms that you can't defend or that incorporates some kind of an error, and the reviewer catches this, you're all but finished. Because reviewers just jump on these. They say, aha, this is a good reason to downweight the proposal. This is a good reason to consider this person doesn't know the area. How could they make such an error? So make sure you get people to read and look especially for errors, because it makes it too easy for them to downgrade the proposal. Okay, and again, in the interest of time, I'm going to speed up a little because these are some common weaknesses in proposals, but that will be on what gets posted. I want to go to common criticisms from reviewers. Not specific enough. What will they really do? Not interesting enough. Lacks originality and insight. Duplicates other work, incremental. Contains errors, too ambitious. Not likely to lead to definitive results. Make sure you review your project description to see if any of these apply, because these are what reviewers are turned off by. These are what they are critical of. In your writing, you might look for these phrases and see if you can avoid them. To understand better, to learn about, to study, to investigate, to find evidence. Those are all much, they have much less impact than to determine, to test, to measure, to rule out, to show. Try to make statements that are specific and that show progress rather than activity. You'll have to provide a one-page summary, and it's extremely important. It is the one part that everybody reads, including some of the public. It's not an abstract. It has to follow the characteristics that are outlined. It's rather a summary of what will be accomplished, and it ought to include the objectives and the review criteria explicitly. So that's what everybody reads. So it's worth extra effort on that one page. Now, I have one piece of advice on budget besides using all the tools that you have, because you're not going to know all of the rules here, and other people can help you a lot in developing a good budget. But my one piece of advice is that don't underestimate. If you think you're going to help yourself by coming in with a proposal that is less costly, you're probably going to hurt yourself, because the reviewers don't care about that. It's not their money. They want to be convinced that you can do this. And if they see a very ambitious proposal with a very small budget, they say, this can't possibly work. This person doesn't understand what it takes to do this, and it's just not feasible at this scale. On the other hand, if you come in a bit high, that's the job of the program officer to negotiate with you, to say, I can't really afford that. Can we cut down the scope of this a little bit and find a way to make it work? Once you have good reviews and review support, you can try to do that. If you don't have that support, if you don't get past the reviewers, you don't ever get to budget negotiation at all. So that is what I just said. And I'll offer a checklist that you can come back to of things that it's a good thing to check your proposal against. And finish by saying that what I've tried to talk about is this flow chart. You start out with your strategic thoughts and what you'd like to do, develop ideas, look for grant opportunities, see how they all mesh together into a project idea, discuss it broadly, design the project, and then write following instructions with lots of revision and informal review. So that's my overview, and I'm going to stop there and invite questions.
Does anybody have any questions? I do have one, actually. I came to the Panda training that they did for the new proposal system. I can't quite remember exactly what they said, but there were some restrictions on talking to NSF officers in particular. And do you happen to know what restrictions there are? It kind of was portrayed as an unfair competition to actually go and address them directly.
There are some, and it depends on what you're trying to do. There are advantages to talking to people when you can. They don't like NCAR to go around NCAR management in talking about activities that in any way relate to NCAR. And so you don't want to talk to the program officers about things that relate to NCAR. I don't know of prohibitions against talking if you're submitting a proposal, although there may be some that I don't know about.
What do you mean with things that are related to NCAR?
Well, NSF provides funds for the facilities, for example, to operate the facilities. And that's a whole section. And if I were to call them up and say, we really need you to provide a different kind of facility, that would not be appropriate.
So that's more
I
like
should go
base
through
funded.
NCAR management, because that is an NCAR function. If it is funding NCAR science, then there's a similar problem. What NCAR has to worry about is that they have a whole program that NSF supports in the chemistry division, and they try to do, for example, and they try to do particular things within that they choose and negotiate with the Science Foundation. They don't want the scientists to come and try to negotiate with them over what that's going to be. So there are restrictions like that, but that doesn't apply to the kind of things that I'm talking about.
Thanks.
Hi, I was wondering about whether or not there's consequences of finishing a project under budget, and how would you go about handling that?
Wonderful. Finishing under budget is no problem at all. You usually would say, there's something else I want to do. Can I ask for an extension to use these funds in this way? And they'll almost always grant that because they've already reserved the funds out of their program. And so extensions are often considered and approved, even without being under budget. So under budget is a great negotiating position. Congratulations if you're there.
Did I hear you correctly that you'd recommend a pre-proposal and talking to the program officer, even if it explicitly states that that's not required?
Yes.
Could you say a little more about that?
Yes. This is part of the discussion. That the pre-proposal, you don't even have to call it that. This is just a statement of what you're thinking about doing. And if you're seeking advice from the program officer, it's much better to have something that you can communicate about. You can call it a pre-proposal, or you can call it just, this is a statement of what I want to do. It's something written down, but it's much better to have that than to have the discussion without that context. It's just something that they can read ahead of time to be prepared for your discussion. And it won't get used in any way. It's just used for the discussion.
Thank you. Kind of a related question. You had a good example of what not to ask a program officer. What are the types of questions that you enjoyed responding to as a program officer?
Things that are asking for mentoring advice are always welcome. Program officers have a bit of a dry job to do. I spent a year reading proposals pretty much continuously. And at the end of that, I was very happy to not have to read proposals anymore. It's a difficult job to do. And it's not very rewarding because most of the time the people who get funded say, oh yeah, I deserve that. And the people don't say, why don't you recognize that? so it's hard for anybody, it's hard to win. To help someone is a win for the program officer. And so asking for help in terms, in the same kind of terms that you would ask a mentor for help. Typical scope, typical budgets, typical mistakes are useful, and they will think about that and try to tell you. And those are good questions. These people are anxious to advance research, they really are.
Can you speak a little bit about the balance between figures and tables and text within a proposal? I mean, it might vary between agency and specific call, but do you have any general guidelines for that?
That's a good topic and a very difficult one because the rules don't care. They say, for example, for NSF 15 pages, you have to decide how you're going to use that. Are you going to use that in a figure or the equivalent amount of words, or how are you going to use it? And so I can't give you a good answer except to say, use what you need to and then try to condense to make it fit, because figures are very valuable. If you don't use any, it will be very hard to convey what you're trying to do. I've seen proposals like that that just try to do it all in words. And they don't work because you end up not being able to convey the same kind of concepts that just a simple figure does convey. So I really recommend the use of figures, but you can't get carried away with it. What I don't like is multi-purpose figures where you say, okay, I only have room for one figure, so I'm going to put 8 subframes in. And I'm going to make them little tiny, And I'm going to make each one on a different topic, and then I'm going to work through that. Figures ought to have 1 point. They ought to be understandable on their own, and you don't want to try to get around this problem by putting them in at such tiny size that you don't make the point. Your best figure ought to be a nice standard size figure in this. I'm not sure if I answered your question, because I don't think there's a generic answer, but use them all.
With the tight funding and more proposals and lower funding rates, is there anything different that you would do in that environment to make your proposal stand out, or you just have to do this better than before?
You, assuming that you're mostly early career scientists, have an advantage in that because of this preference for early career investigators, that even in a tight funding environment, you will get funded in some cases where more senior people won't, because they will say, you need it and we need to do it for the advancement of the field. So I think being an early career scientist actually has some advantage in that. Now, of course, you can lose that advantage if you don't write a good proposal, but I don't know other advice I can give other than it calls for paying attention to the writing. It calls for paying attention to the communication. And part of the reason for that is that everybody is getting more proposals. The program officers are getting more, the reviewers are getting more, everybody's reading more of this, and they can't spend as much time as they could if they had half as many proposals. So if it's hard to read, they're going to be bothered by that. They're going to be slow to understand. They might not put the time in that it takes. If it's easy and clear, it's a great advantage. So if nothing else, I'd say this is the time for good writing, even more than usual.
Thanks. Just one more question. So let's say you write your proposal, you get funded, and you do your work. At the end of the 3 years, you actually think it's valuable to continue that research. How is that different from incremental research, and how do you pose that, or how do you propose it without it sounding boring and just incremental?
No, that is different. That is very valuable to do, because you now have a start on it, and you could probably do it better than anybody else can. You've shown that it is an interesting area of research, and you've learned something about it, and carrying it to the next level is different from starting a new direction altogether, or starting a direction that somebody else is already pursuing. So I think my comments don't apply to that. That would be very, very useful. In some cases where I've presented this, I have a whole set of slides that I use to talk about, okay, now you've got the award, what do you do? And that's a serious problem. People usually don't think about ahead of time. What's going to happen when I actually get this? And suddenly they, surprise, get the award, and they have to start working on it. And there are a lot of things that have to spin up very fast, because you have a limited time to produce results. You have to start thinking about how this is going to get to publication in time to justify that at the end. You can say, when it says results from prior NSF support, that I obtained these results and published these papers, and those take time. So unless you get started early, you have a problem with this continuation step. You can't say, well, I'm underway and I'll eventually have some results to show, because then they'll just say, finish the work. So there's a whole series of things that we could talk about in terms of how to actually conduct it. But as far as continuing it, if you're on your way, don't let my comments detract from that. That's a good direction to go. That's back in what I was talking about as thematic research, where you develop a particular area until you are known for that research.
Anybody else? Yeah.
This is perhaps just a personal opinion, but it seems to me it's much easier to get a field program funded than it is to study data collected in a field program. Could you comment on that?
You're right. It is a weakness, and it is something that there are two big weaknesses in connection with observational work that are the fault of the reviewers, I think. It's hard to get a good review on something that proposes data collection. And it's hard to get a good review on something that proposes instrument development. Those two are difficult areas to pursue. And the reason is that everybody thinks they can do it better, that they say, yes, that's a good idea, but the data aren't just right, and it's much better to go collect something else, not realizing that when you go out to collect the data, then there are going to be a whole new set of problems. It's easy to design a field project and say, oh, this sounds ideal. And then you get there and you find that the measurements aren't quite what you expected and that there are some problems. But at the review stage, that often doesn't come up. It's just, this is going to work and it's a great idea and it tends to review well. Once they're collected, then those problems are all existing in the data and people are reluctant to support those. I think it's a weakness of the review process. And the corresponding one is a weakness in the instrument development process, because usually what happens is those proposals get sent to the three people who are expert in that measurement. And of course, they think they know how to do it better. And it's very hard to get a good review of an instrument proposal.
Actually, on that same topic, sometimes I feel you can get an instrument development and deployment proposal through, but then there's like no funding for the work that comes after that. So you get your instrument set up and it starts making measurements, but then nobody actually gets to work on the data, which is the valuable bit in my opinion. Is that the fault of the funding agencies or the people that write the proposals and don't include that part of the work because their work is just to create this instrument, or where's the problem?
Yeah, well, that's another slant on the same question, that how do we make good use of the data that we have collected? If you don't propose to carry through, you often are missing an opportunity, because as you get to the end of such a proposal, you often can ask for an extension to follow up with the analysis as the next phase.
Shouldn't it be required to have this follow-up whenever you submit a proposal for something like that?
Often what happens is that the proposal is limited in scope because of either the funds that the program officer might have available or what you've asked for, or some limitation. And so in the process of negotiation, they might say, okay, get some data collected and show that it's good, and then we'll think about how to follow up. You're right, it ought to be part of that follow-up, but often it's not, and then it's relatively easy, compared to just coming in cold, to ask for an extension which will allow you to do some analysis, for a couple of reasons. One is that often that's cheaper, you don't have the instrument costs anymore, and the other is that you are in the ideal position to do it. Now, whose fault is it? Well, it's everybody's fault. It is a weakness of the system, and it's something that we do see, that those two areas we're talking about are difficult areas to pursue.
Thanks.
Your actually talk was really focused on NSF proposals, right? And so, because at NCAR, we are actually often writing proposals to NASA, DOE, and I'm wondering how proposals going to those agencies are different and reviewed in a different way from NSF, because not only they would like some science, they would like us to use their models, their data, and often it's very hard to do fundamental science. And so could you just comment on that, please?
Yes, that falls mostly into the category that I was referring to as targeted solicitations. They are looking for people to do a job for them. And whether or not you can do that determines how successful you will be. Can you put a particular instrument on an airplane for a campaign? Can you develop the algorithm for using the satellite data, or whatever is required? That's what the proposal asks you to do. And then you just have to step back and say, do you want to do that? Does it really fit, and are you willing to play the game? If it fits what you want to do, then the difference is that you simply have to follow their rules as much as you can, because there's somebody who has designed a program and has these components in mind for how the program is going to fit together. And they're going to assemble it out of the proposals that they get. So they're looking for the fit to this overall program concept. And you have to fit into that. You can't say, I think I want to go this direction. You have to say, this is how you fit into the program. And that's an important difference compared to the Science Foundation or the rare unsolicited proposals. I mean, the NASA Roses often has opportunities for things that are not focused on their objectives, but can be investigator selected. And those are a different category, and maybe that's closer to the Science Foundation. But the ones you're talking about are really targeted solicitation.
Like proposal review panels, they say, oh, you want to use WRF-Chem. Why would we use WRF-Chem? We have our models. And you feel like this is not really fair. So in my proposal, should I really say I'm going to use just an alpha model and not name the model, or should I risk myself, NCAR model?
Right, and I think the answer is that they have a concept of how this thing ought to work for their own program. And it might be more advantageous to them to see this component of the model be used rather than an NCAR model, just because then they gain experience with that, they get something that they can use in the future, and it's programmatic. So sorry, it's unfortunate.
Any other questions? No? Well, let's just wrap up here. Thank you very much.